I came home on a Tuesday afternoon, and my wife's garden had been turned into a gravel lot. 51 azalea bushes, each one for a year of her life, were now nothing but crushed stumps. A man on a mini excavator was scraping the last of them into the roadside ditch. My son stood on the porch, clipboard in hand. When he saw my car pull into the driveway, he just smiled and waved. I waved back. That was the last mistake I ever made as a father. Because the excavator in the yard wasn't just grinding up my wife's garden. It was erasing a secret she had left behind before she died. And by the time I understood what was really happening, it was already too late to save anything. My name is Wilbur Chastang. Everybody's called me Webb since I was 9, and nobody remembers why, including me. I'm 72. I live on Bienville Court in Mobile, Alabama, in a raised cottage with a tin roof and a foundation that has been settling politely since 1932. For 41 years I was a bar pilot. That word doesn't mean anything to most people, so let me tell you what it is, because it's the whole story, and you can't understand a single thing that happened in my house without it. A ship comes in from Panama, 900 feet long, 100,000 tons of steel, with a Greek captain on the bridge who has crossed an ocean without help from anybody. And 30 miles out, in the dark, in whatever the Gulf is doing that night, that ship slows down, and I come alongside in a launch, and I climb a rope ladder up the side of a moving vessel, and I walk onto a bridge full of men I have never met in my life. And the captain, a man with more sea time than I'll ever have, looks at me, and he says 4 words out loud. "You have the con." And I say 4 words back. "I have the con." Both of us say it, out loud, so that every man on that bridge hears it, and there is not 1 second in the history of that ship where 2 people think they're steering. That is the entire job. 41 years, 10,000 ships, and I never one time took a wheel that wasn't handed to me. Nobody gets hurt on the water by giving up command. They get hurt by the ones who take it while you're sleeping. It started in September, the way most things in Mobile start in September. We'd had a storm come up through Bayou La Batre, not a big one, a cat one that everybody laughed at until it stalled and sat over us for 11 hours and dropped 19 inches. My street got water in the yards. Some streets got it in the walls. My son's street got it in the walls. Dathan called me at 9 at night from a phone that kept cutting out. He said, "Dad, we're going to come stay a while." Not can we. I noticed that and I put it down, and I didn't pick it back up for 6 weeks. He's 39 years old. Nita's 36. They pulled in at 11 with a U-Haul trailer and 2 dogs, and my daughter-in-law stood in my carport in the rain with a cardboard box that had gone soft on the bottom, and she was holding it from underneath with both arms like a person carrying a baby. She said, "Webb, I'm so sorry." She apologized. That's the thing I want you to hold on to, because Nita apologized in my carport at 11 o'clock at night, and Dathan walked past me into my kitchen and turned on the light without asking. Neither of them meant anything by it. That's the horror of the whole thing. I said what any man would say. I said, "Y'all get in out of that." Now here's what I knew about my son's job, and here's what I didn't know, and the gap between those 2 things is where this entire story lives. Dathan is an insurance adjuster, has been for 11 years. You know what that is. That's the man who comes to your house after the water goes down. He walks your rooms with a flashlight and a moisture meter, and he writes down a number, and that number is what your life is worth now, and you can argue with him, but you're going to lose. My son spends his days telling people their houses are not worth what they think. 11 years of that. And what I did not know, what I didn't find out until March, standing in my own yard, and I'll get there, is that when the water came into his house in September, my son, an insurance adjuster, was underinsured. He'd let the flood policy lapse. Not out of stupidity. Out of the thing that happens to adjusters, which is that you start believing the map. The map said his street was Zone X. Zone X means it doesn't flood. He'd written that sentence on other people's paperwork 400 times. 19 inches of rain does not read the map. So my son sat in my kitchen in September with his shoes off and his socks soaked, and he had $140,000 of damage and about $11,000 of coverage, and he did not say 1 word about it to me. He would rather have taken my house than said that sentence to my face. I'd like you to remember that we're not talking about a greedy man. We are talking about a man who could not say a sentence. If you've ever been the person who was supposed to know better, and then didn't, and then had to sit at a table with the people who trusted you, you already know what he was carrying. And you know he'd carry it a long way before he'd put it down in front of his father. The rules came in October, and they didn't come on paper. Dathan set up a shared calendar on my telephone. He sat next to me at my own kitchen table and he took my phone out of my hand gently, the way you'd take something from a child who's had it long enough, and he did some things to it and gave it back. Now there were appointments in it. Appointments I hadn't made. Water heater flush. Gutter contractor 9 a.m. Pest Thurs. And then he bought a label maker. I have thought about that label maker more than I've thought about almost anything in my life. It's a little plastic thing, prints on a sticky tape. He labeled my kitchen cabinets. Flour. Sugar. Coffee. He labeled the drawer by the stove. The one where Ola kept her seed packets in rubber bands. 40 years of them, some of them from stores that don't exist. The label on that drawer said Misk. Misk. I stood in that kitchen at 6 in the morning looking at a sticker on a drawer, and something turned over in my chest, and it took me a year to find the right word for it because it wasn't anger. It was the feeling of being surveyed. You know that feeling. Somebody comes into a room you've lived in for 40 years and they see inventory. They see square footage and storage solutions and a drawer of loose paper that needs a label. They cannot see a woman standing at that drawer in a housecoat in 1994 deciding whether to plant snapdragons. Nothing in my kitchen was cruel. Every single thing in my kitchen was reasonable. That's how it goes, and if it's happening to you right now, you're probably telling yourself the same thing I told myself, which is, what would I even complain about? The thermostat went from 74 down to 69, because Dathan runs warm. My pickup came out of the carport and went to the curb, because the dogs needed the carport when it rained, and I don't go out much at night. That's what he said. You don't go out much at night. 41 years of climbing a rope ladder onto a moving ship in the middle of the night. The tide chart came off the refrigerator. Ola drew that thing by hand in 1988 on a piece of butcher paper because she got tired of me griping about the almanac, and she drew a little moon in the corner with a face on it, and it had been on that refrigerator for 36 years. In its place, Dathan put a printed sheet in a plastic sleeve. It said Property Improvement Schedule. I moved Ola's tide chart to the side. I didn't take it down. I just slid it over so I could still see the moon. And I said out loud, to my son, that's real organized. He let out a breath he'd been holding since September. That was my mistake, not the waving. That. I said that's real organized, and I meant it as a knife, and it landed like a permission slip, and my son took it and he ran. Etta Beausarge found me in the shed in January. Etta is 74. For 31 years, she ran dispatch for the pilot station. She was the voice on the radio at 3 in the morning. And if you have never heard a woman calmly talk a scared man through a tow that's coming across the channel sideways, you have not lived. Etta knows what fear sounds like in a voice. That's her whole gift. She heard 400 men be afraid on the radio and pretend they weren't. She came around the side of my shed with a styrofoam cup of boiled peanuts, and she stood in the door. She said, Webb, your yard looks like a rental. And I said the boy's just tidying up. And Etta Beausarge chewed a peanut and looked at me for about 8 seconds, and she said, you sound like a man calling in a mayday and dressing it up as a routine report. I didn't say anything. She said, 31 years, honey. I could hear it through the static. If somebody in your life has ever looked at you and heard the thing under the thing, I hope you were braver with them than I was with her, because I stood in my own shed, and I told an old friend that everything was fine, and she let me, and she went home. That's on me. She gave me a door and I closed it. In February, I did the only aggressive thing I did in this entire story, and I'm still proud of it, and it accomplished nothing. There's a horn in my shed. It came off the pilot boat Sarah Cade when they scrapped her in 2009, and it's a compressed air horn about the size of a coffee can, and it is not a novelty item. It is a signaling device. At 20 of 6 on a Thursday morning, I carried it out to my back steps. There's a thing in the rules of the road that landsmen don't know. If a vessel is coming at you and you cannot tell what she intends if you look at her and you don't understand what she's doing, and you're not sure she sees the danger, you don't call anybody. You don't get on the radio. You sound 5 short, rapid blasts. 5. That's it. And every mariner on this earth knows exactly what it means, and what it means is this. I do not understand your intentions. I doubt whether sufficient action is being taken to avoid collision. It is called the danger signal. I stood on my back steps in Mobile, Alabama, in the dark, in a bathrobe, and I sounded 5 short, rapid blasts. Dogs went off for 4 blocks. A light came on at the petways. Somewhere down toward the bay, A man on a shrimp boat probably sat straight up in his bunk. Dathan came out onto the porch in a t-shirt with his hair standing up, and he said, "Dad, Dad, what is wrong with you?" I set the horn down on the step. I said, "That's the danger signal." He stared at me. I said, "It means I do not understand your intentions." And here's the thing. He knew. He grew up on this bay. He crewed the launch 2 summers when he was in high school, and I made him learn the sound signals before I let him near the wheel. He knew exactly what those 5 blasts meant, and he stood on my porch and he heard it. And then he rubbed his face and he said, "Dad, it's 5 in the morning." And he went back inside. I heard it. That's what he told me later, on the sidewalk, in front of everybody. He said, "I heard it. Now let me tell you about the barbecue, because this is where the bone broke." Dathan had people from his office over in November. Regional adjusters. A man from Atlanta named Kirkland who was somebody's boss. I stayed out back. That's my way. I was scraping a hull patch off a John boat I've been meaning to sell since 2011. And around 7 I came in through the kitchen door with my hands filthy and a chandlery cap on, and there were 9 people in my living room drinking beer out of my wife's glasses. Kirkland was near the counter. He looked up at me and he was perfectly pleasant, and he asked Dathan, "Who's this?" And my son said, "That's Webb. That's Webb. Not this is my father. Not this is the man whose house you're standing in. Just a name, handed to a stranger like a coaster." And Kirkland, being polite, said, "Webb, good to meet you. What line of work were you in?" And before I could open my mouth, my son answered for me. He said, "Dad worked on the water. Worked on the water. I want to be careful here, because I've had 2 years to make this into something it wasn't, and I refuse to." He didn't lie. That's the thing. It is technically, factually true that I worked on the water. And that sentence would describe a man who ran a deck barge, or scraped barnacles, or fished for a living, all of which are honorable, and none of which is what I did. I was a commissioned bar pilot for the state of Alabama for 41 years. I have taken the con of 10,000 ships. There are captains in Rotterdam and Vera Cruz and Piraeus who could pick my voice out of a crowd. And Kirkland said, "That's nice," and he turned around to get another beer. Nobody was cruel. There was no villain in that room. My son shortened his father into 4 words because the long version would have taken 30 seconds, and the party was going fine. I stood there with a filthy cap in my hand. And I'll tell you what I almost said, because I have never told anybody. I almost said, "Son, tell him what I did." Just that, 6 words. I almost turned to my boy in front of 9 strangers and asked him to say the name of my life out loud. I didn't. Because if he'd hesitated, if there'd been even a half-second of hesitation while he decided whether it was worth it, I would not have survived that half-second. So I went out to the shed, and I sat on a paint bucket in the dark, and I waited for them all to go home. If you have ever been in a room where someone you love shortened you to save time, and you smiled about it, that's the whole club right there, and none of us talk about it, because there's nothing to point at. Nothing happened. Nobody said anything wrong. That's the trick of it. It doesn't make any noise. The real thing came in January, on a Sunday, when I got up at midnight because I'm 72 and iced tea after supper is a young man's game. Light under their door. Dathan's voice, low. He was on the phone. I know now it was a broker. He said, "It has to close before the maps." And then he said, "No, listen before. If it's still Zone X on paper, we get out clean. After that, it's 11 and change a year, and nobody in this city can carry that." I stood in my hallway barefoot on carpet I paid for. The maps. I didn't know what he meant. I'm going to say that plainly, because these stories always have the old man understanding everything instantly, and I didn't. I stood in the dark, and I didn't understand my own son's sentence. I went to the library on Tuesday. A young woman named Charisse showed me how to pull up the county's preliminary flood insurance rate maps, the drafts, the ones that get published for comment before they go into effect. And there was my street. Bienville Court, which has never taken a foot of water in 92 years, was going from Zone X to Zone AE, effective the following year, which means the flood insurance on this house goes from $1,900 a year to somewhere north of $11,000, which means the house doesn't sell, which means the house becomes an anchor with a roof on it, and the person holding it goes down with it. I sat in a public library in downtown Mobile, and I understood my son completely. He wasn't robbing me. He was salvaging me. He had 18 months. He had a professional certainty, earned by 11 years of walking through other people's ruin, that his mother's house was about to become worthless, and he had a father he could not say that sentence to. Dad, Mama's house is about to be worth nothing, and we have to sell it before anybody finds out. He could not say it, so instead he made a calendar. He labeled the drawers, he staged it. Everything my son did to me was correct. He just never said any of it out loud. Now I have to tell you the part I've been walking around for 2,000 words, and I'd rather not, and that's exactly why I'm going to. In the spring of 2019, Ola had about 9 weeks left, and she knew it, and she was meaner about dying than she ever was about living, which I loved her for. There was an afternoon in that room at Providence with the light coming through those miserable blinds, and she'd sent Dathan down to the cafeteria for something she didn't want. And when he was gone, she took hold of my wrist. She had no strength left, and she still had the grip of a woman who'd pulled 51 azaleas out of buckets and put them in the ground. She said, "Webb, not Dathan." I said, "What?" She said, "The house. Don't put it to Dathan." And I said something like, "He's our boy." And Ola Chastang looked at the ceiling and said, "He is. And he loves us. And he'll do what he thinks is best." She stopped to breathe, which took her a while by then. And what he thinks is best will be to sell it. I did not argue with her. That's the part. Understand me. I did not argue with my dying wife about our son. She said, "Put it to Nita." Nita, my daughter-in-law, married in 3 years at that point. A middle school band teacher who once conducted 41 children through Ode to Joy in a gymnasium in a way that made me cry into a program. Ola said, "That girl will not sell a thing that isn't hers to sell." And in June of 2019, 5 weeks after we buried my wife, I sat in Roscoe Ladnier's office on Dauphin Street, and I deeded my house to Nita Chastang, reserving a life estate for myself. Which means, it is hers. It has been hers for 6 years. I live in it until I die, and nobody on this earth can move me. Nobody knew. Not Nita, not Dathan, not Etta. I never told my son. For 6 years, I sat across a Thanksgiving table from a man I had already convicted. I want to say that again, slower, because it took me a year and a half to be able to say it at all. My wife looked at our son on her deathbed and she saw exactly what he would become. She was right. She was right down to the month. And the two of us, the two people who made him, took that judgment, and we sealed it in a lawyer's file, and then we let him walk around inside it for 6 years, being watched. He never got a chance to answer the charge. He never even knew there was one. I took the con of my son's life in a hospital room in 2019, and I never said it out loud, and neither did his mother. And then, 6 years later, he did the exact same thing to me, and I was shocked. The garden tour is the last Saturday in March, when the azaleas come, and this whole city loses its mind about it. People walk the streets in Oakley and Ashland Place from 10 in the morning until dark. Old ladies put out lemonade. It has been going on since before I was born. Ola planted her first azalea the year we bought the house. Pride of Mobile, deep pink, and she put one in every single year of her life after that. And when she died, there were 51 of them, and they were 7 feet high, and in the last week of March, that yard did not look like it belonged to this world. The 51st one, the one she planted the last spring she was walking, never bloomed. 6 years it never bloomed, just green. I watered it anyway. Every year I'd go out there in March and stand in front of it like a fool. On the Tuesday before the garden tour, I came home, and it was gravel. All of them. There was a skid steer and a man in a safety vest and a pile of root balls in the ditch with the dirt still on them, and my son was on the porch with a clipboard, and he waved. And I waved back. He had a broker's open house scheduled for Saturday. Same afternoon as the garden tour. That's why he'd done the yard. Because on the last Saturday in March there are 1,100 people walking down Bienville Court, and every one of them walks past a for sale sign, and gravel and boxwoods show a foundation better than a wall of 30-year-old azaleas that a buyer's inspector is going to want to look behind. He'd done the math. He's very good at his job. I didn't say a word to him, not one. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I ate dinner across the table from my son, and I said nothing, and on Friday I drove to Dauphin Street and sat down in Roscoe Ladnier's office. And I want to tell you why I went, because everybody assumes they know. I did not go there to spring a trap. I went there to give my son the house. That's the truth. I sat in that chair, 72 years old, and I said, "Roscoe, I need to undo the 2019 papers. The boy's drowning, and he's too proud to say it, and I'd rather hand it to him than watch him take it. Roscoe Ladnier is 81. He took his glasses off. He said, Webb, it's not yours to give. And I said, I know it's a life estate. I'm not asking to sell it. I'm asking to... And he said, son. He hasn't called me son in 30 years. It is Nita's. It has been Nita's since June the 11th, 2019. You can't give away what you don't have, and you can't take back what you gave, and you knew that when you signed it, because I explained it to you twice, and you told me to hush. I sat there. He said, does she know? And I said no. And Roscoe Ladnier, who buried his own son in 2004, said the truest thing anybody said to me in this whole business. He said, Webb, you've been holding a loaded thing in that house for 6 years, and you never once told anybody where you put it. Saturday came up hot and blue, and the whole street smelled like other people's flowers. By 10 in the morning there were people everywhere. Strollers, church groups, 2 women from the Historical Society with clipboards. Down at the corner, the Petways had a card table with lemonade and a jar for the animal shelter. And in my yard, gravel, and a sign. Nita was out front by 9 with a folding table and a tray of little paper cups and a pitcher, because she is the kind of woman who will not let people walk past her house thirsty, even when she doesn't know what her house is. She had no idea. I need that understood. She thought Dathan had the house listed with my blessing. She'd asked me once, in February, standing at the sink, and she'd said, Webb, are you sure about all this? And I'd said, it's fine, sugar. I lied to her too. Add it to the pile. The broker was a young man named Trask in a blue blazer. He was handing flyers to the garden tour people as they walked by, which is exactly what I'd have done in his shoes. He handed one to me. He didn't know who I was. He was standing on my grass, which is to say my gravel, and he put a piece of paper in my hand with a photograph of my own house on it, and under the photograph, it said, Charming Raised Cottage Investor Opportunity Motivated Seller. I looked at it a long time. Motivated seller. And Dathan came across the yard with a folder under his arm and Roscoe Ladnier's business card in his shirt pocket, because he'd called Roscoe on Thursday to ask about a quitclaim, and Roscoe had said, come Saturday, I'll be there, and had not told him one other thing. Roscoe was standing by my mailbox in a seersucker suit at 11 o'clock in the morning, 81 years old, sweating. Dathan said, Dad, can we do this now, while everybody's out? It'll take 4 minutes. He had a pen. He'd bought pens. And people were walking by, strollers going past. A woman said, oh, didn't there used to be azaleas here? I looked at my son, and I said, Dathan, that's not mine to sign. He smiled, the way you smile at somebody who's confused. He said, Dad, I've got the deed history right here. It's in your... And Roscoe Ladnier walked up onto my gravel and said, it isn't. 9 minutes. That's what it took. I have been living inside those 9 minutes ever since, and I'm going to walk you through them the way I'd walk a channel, one buoy at a time. Roscoe opened his folder. He did not raise his voice. Roscoe has never raised his voice in his life. He just gets quieter and quieter until you lean in. He said, the property at 4 Bienville Court was conveyed on June the 11th, 2019, by warranty deed, with a life estate reserved to Wilbur Chastang. Dathan said, conveyed to who? And Roscoe said, to Nita Kirk Chastang. Nobody moved. Somewhere down the block, somebody's kid was hitting a fence post with a stick. The Petway's lemonade jar clinked. A woman on the sidewalk said something about the Sanderses' camellias. Trask, the broker, was looking at his shoes with the concentration of a man who has understood that his commission is gone and that he should not be here. And every single person in that yard turned around and looked at my daughter-in-law. Nita was standing behind a folding table with a plastic pitcher in her hand. She said, what? She said it small, like a girl. She set the pitcher down and she put both hands flat on that folding table, and she looked at Roscoe, and she looked at her husband, and she looked at me, and I watched a 36-year-old woman understand in about 4 seconds that she had spent 6 months carrying boxes and holding her tongue inside a house that belonged to her. She said, since when? And Roscoe said, 6 years, ma'am. And she looked at me and her chin went, and she said, Webb, you let me apologize to you in your carport. That's what she said. Out of everything. Out of a house worth $340,000 and a flood map that was going to eat it. She stood there, and what came out of her was that she had said, "I'm so sorry." Web in the rain, holding a soft cardboard box in a carport that was hers. I couldn't answer her. I have never answered her. Then Dathan spoke, and his voice was not the voice of a man who'd been caught. He said, "You knew." I said, "Yes." He said, "For 6 years." I said, "Since your mother told me to." And I watched my son's face do the thing that I will be seeing on the day I die. He said, "Mama," just her name, in a yard full of gravel where her flowers had been, in front of 1,100 strangers walking by, looking at other people's azaleas. And then he said it. He got there before I did. He is smarter than I am, and he always has been. He said, "She looked at me and decided what I'd do." I said, "Yes." He said, "In the hospital." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you agreed with her?" And I said, "Yes." He stood in that yard and he started shaking. Not crying. Shaking, the way a man shakes when the floor of his life turns out to be a lid. He said, "You watched me for 6 years." He said, "You sat at Thanksgiving and you passed me the rice." And then he stopped, because there wasn't any bottom to it, and he knew it, and so did I. Roscoe Ladnier quietly closed his folder and stepped back off the gravel onto the public sidewalk, because he is an old lawyer, and he knows when a thing has stopped being legal. I said, "Dathan, I'd have given it to you Friday. I went to Roscoe on Friday to try." And my son laughed. God, that laugh. He said, "That's supposed to make it better?" And it wasn't. It wasn't supposed to make anything better. Because a gift given on Friday to a man you convicted 6 years ago in a hospital room isn't a gift. It's a settlement. He said, "You know why I couldn't tell you about the maps?" I said no. He said, "Because you'd have looked at me like Mama looked at me." And there it is. There's the whole thing, standing in my front yard in a blazer with a folder of pens. My son could not say a true sentence to his father because he had been watched by his mother, and he could feel it, and he never knew what it was he was feeling. He knew. Some part of that boy had known since 2019 that a decision had been rendered about him. And you know what a man does when he can feel a judgment on him that nobody will name? He starts trying to prove it wrong by being competent. He starts managing. He starts fixing things for people who didn't ask. He starts labeling drawers. He becomes the exact man they said he was, trying to prove he isn't. I have thought about that every night for 2 years. And then I said the last thing, and it's the only thing I'd say again. I said, "You heard the horn." He stood there. I said, 5 short blasts on my back steps in February. You knew what it was. I taught you what it was when you were 15 years old. And Dathan Chastang looked at his father and he said, "I heard it. And that's when I lost it. Not before. Not the azaleas. Not the flyer. Not that's Webb. That." Because he heard the danger signal and he understood it and he went back inside, and I have sounded that horn at a tow captain doing something stupid in the channel at 2 in the morning, and every one of those men, every one, strangers, drunk, exhausted, every one of them answered. My own boy heard 5 blasts and went to bed. I took a breath and I stepped forward, and I did the thing I have done 10,000 times in the dark on the bridges of ships belonging to men I'd never met. I said, "Dathan, I have the con. And I want to tell you why I said it, because it was not a threat." On a ship, when the pilot says that, the captain has to answer. He has to say "you have the con" out loud, so that everybody hears it, and no man on that bridge is confused about who is steering. I was not taking anything from my son. I was asking him, for the first time in his life, to hand it to me out loud. 6 years I'd been steering him without telling him. I was offering to do it in front of witnesses. He opened his mouth. 22 years old and 39 years old and 9 years old, all standing in that yard at once. And he couldn't say it. He stood on his mother's gravel, with his mouth open, and he could not get 4 words out, and Nita picked up her pitcher and poured it out on the ground, and she said, "Dathan, go get your things. Here's what happened, and I'm going to tell it the flat way, because the other version is a lie, and you deserve better. Nita did not sell the house. She also did not give it back to me. And Roscoe says she can't, and I've stopped asking. It is hers. It says so in a book downtown. She and Dathan separated in April, and were back together by November, which surprised everybody, including them, and they live in a rented place off Airport Boulevard, while their own house gets put back together at the pace a man can afford when he was underinsured and too ashamed to say so. The maps came out in October, right on schedule. Bienville Court is Zone AE now. Everything Dathan knew, he knew correctly, 18 months early. The insurance on this house is $11,400 a year. I found out in June that Nita has been paying it. Out of a middle school band teacher's salary, in 12 installments, without telling me, for 2 years, on a house she cannot live in, and would not sell. I found the notice in the mail because they misspelled her name and it bounced to me. I sat down on the front steps with that envelope for about an hour. I never confronted her about it. I did the same thing everybody in my family does. I put it in a drawer. I'm not fixed. I want to be clear about that. I'm 72, I'm not fixed, and I don't think this ends with anybody being fixed. Dathan came back in November, 8 months after. Not for dinner. He came on a Saturday morning at 7 with a shovel in the bed of his truck and a 5-gallon bucket, and he didn't knock. I looked out the kitchen window, and my son was on his knees in the gravel with a mattock, breaking that ground up by hand. I stood at the sink and watched him for maybe 40 minutes. He put in one azalea. And it was the wrong one. It was a Formosa, that loud magenta they sell at every hardware store on the Gulf Coast, and Ola's were Pride of Mobile, which is a softer pink, and any woman in this city over the age of 60 could tell you the difference across a street. I could have gone out there and told him. I could have said, "Son, that's the wrong color. Your mother planted Pride of Mobile, 51 of them, and there's a nursery on Old Shell Road that carries them." I stood at my sink and I let my son plant the wrong flower, and I have never made a better decision in my life. He came up on the porch afterward with dirt to his elbows, and he sat down on the top step with his back to me, which is how the men in my family have every important conversation, and after a while he said something to the yard. He said, "You have the con." 4 words. 8 months late. I said, "I have the con." And then I sat down beside him on the step, and neither one of us said another word for about 20 minutes, and a mockingbird went off in the Petway's oak, and that was it. That was the whole reconciliation. 2 men on a step, filthy, saying nothing. There are 49 to go, and he does one every few months, and they are all going to be the wrong color, and I am never going to tell him. Here's what I've got, and it cost me a garden. The mistake most people make is thinking that the damage in a family comes from the things people do. It doesn't. My son labeled a drawer. That's all he really did, that was his own. Everything else he did was right, and he was right about the maps, and he was right about the house. The damage came from the things that were never said out loud. He took the wheel of my life and never said it. And 6 years before that, in a hospital room with the blinds down, his mother and I took the wheel of his, and we never said that either. 2 men steering the same ship in the dark, each one certain he had the con, neither one saying the words. That's how you go aground. That is exactly and precisely how you go aground, and it is the only way I have ever seen it happen in 41 years. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to do today, and it costs nothing but about 90 seconds of the worst feeling you'll have all week. If you are quietly taking over some part of somebody's life, their money, their meals, their driving, their doctor's appointments, the way they keep their kitchen, I want you to say it to them. In words. To their face, today. Say, "I have started managing this for you." And then close your mouth and let them answer. Because they might say yes. Most of them will say yes. People are more willing to hand over the wheel than you think, if you'll only stand there and ask for it. And if they say no, then you don't have it. That's the rule. It has to be given, or it isn't yours, no matter how right you are. And here's the question I'd like you to carry around, and I'm still carrying it, and it's heavier than the horn. What have you already decided about somebody privately, permanently, maybe years ago, that you have never once given them the chance to answer? Because they can feel it. I promise you they can feel it. They don't know what it is, but they know there's a verdict in the room with them, and they'll spend their whole life proving it wrong in the exact way that proves it right. Ola was right about our son, and being right about him is what made him. Now, I'd like to hear from you, if you've got a minute, and I mean that literally I'm out on this step most evenings and there's nobody to talk to but a mockingbird with a grudge. If you think I did right on Saturday, if a man who's been erased in his own kitchen is entitled to have the truth read out loud in his own yard, put a 1 in the comments, and tell me so, because some nights I'd like to believe it. If you think I should have handed my son that house on Friday, and never told him about the hospital room, and let him be a man who did a hard thing for his father, instead of a man who found out he'd been watched put a 2. And if you think The way I do most mornings when I look at that one loud magenta bush in a yard full of rock, that the real damage in this family was done in 2019 by two people who loved a boy enough to decide who he was and not enough to tell him put a 3. And tell me who you've decided about. Tell me where you're listening from, the city, and what the clock says where you are. It's 20 past 9 here on Bienville Court, and it's 91 degrees at night in June, and the frogs are so loud I can hardly hear myself. And if somebody has ever taken something from you an inch at a time, and been reasonable about every single inch, so that you got to the end of it with nothing to point at and no way to explain why you were angry, I'd like to hear about that most of all. Nobody counts us, because there's never anything to count. If this sounded like your kitchen, come sit with me a while. Subscribe. I'm an old pilot with a rock garden and a boat I'll never sell, and I've got a lot of these, and telling them to a mockingbird has not been working out. Go find whoever you've been steering. Ask them for the wheel. They might just hand it to you. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Mobile, Alabama to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.